In a quiet town, Thomas Parker, a retired teacher, struggled to get by on his small pension. His years of teaching had shaped countless lives, but now his days were empty. That rainy morning, on his way to the coffee shop, he saw a homeless man shivering under a tattered blanket. Despite his own financial worries, Thomas couldn't turn away. He gave the last of his pension to help the man, knowing it would leave him with nothing. As he walked home, unaware of the consequences, he had no idea that his act of kindness was being witnessed. 24 hours later, the sound of jets filled the quiet morning sky. 3 corporate jets landed, cutting through the grey clouds. The people inside them had seen something in Mr. Parker, something that would transform his world forever. Hi everyone, welcome to Graceful Storyteller. Today, I'm excited to share a new story with you. Mr. Parker lived alone in a small apartment. His wife had passed away several years ago, and now his only company was his cat and the memories of his teaching days. Every morning he woke up early to have breakfast, hoping to make it through another day with as little stress as possible. His pension was enough to cover his modest living expenses, but nothing more. He spent his days volunteering at the local library and occasionally giving private lessons to young students who couldn't afford regular tutoring. It wasn't much, but it kept him busy and gave him a sense of purpose. Every day he spent hours reminiscing about the impact he had made on his students. Those memories were his biggest treasures now. He had no family to rely on, no big savings or luxury, just his small pension and the joy of knowing he had shaped the lives of hundreds of students over his long career. That Tuesday morning started like any other. The rain had been pouring all night, leaving the streets flooded and slippery. It was the kind of weather that made the city seem empty, as people rushed to stay dry and avoid the streets. Mr. Parker had been walking to the coffee shop when he saw the man again, the same homeless figure, under the park bench. The wind blew harder, making the man's clothes cling to him, and his hands shook as he clutched his coat tightly. The sight stirred something inside Mr. Parker. He couldn't simply walk away again. His thoughts flashed back to the many students he had helped over the years, many of whom had struggled in ways that were hard to imagine. He couldn't let this man face the same fate. "Sir, please be careful," Mr. Parker called out, but the wind carried his voice away. The homeless man didn't hear him. Then, it happened. The man's foot slipped on the wet pavement, and he fell to the ground with a sharp cry of pain. Mr. Parker immediately rushed over to him, his heart pounding. He dropped down beside him, his concern for the man outweighing his fear of the storm and the consequences of his actions. The rules were clear. He was retired now and didn't need to worry about losing a job. But that pension, the only thing that had kept him afloat, was now at risk. He had to make a choice. As he knelt beside the man, helping him to sit up, Mr. Parker could hear the echoes of his old supervisor's voice in his mind from his last teaching years. "Follow the rules, Parker. Stick to the lesson plan. Stay in your lane." But this wasn't a lesson plan. This was life, and Mr. Parker couldn't turn his back on someone who needed him. He looked at the fallen man, the elderly man clutching his leg, the pain visible on his face. And Mr. Parker thought of his own family, his wife, who had passed away after a long illness, his children, who had moved far away. What if this man was someone's father, brother, or son? What if this was him, lying alone, needing help? Without another thought, he stood and helped the man into the nearby diner, calling for medical help along the way. The rain poured harder as they waited for an ambulance. "My name's Thomas," he said softly to the man. "Are you badly hurt?" The man nodded weakly, unable to speak much more. Mr. Parker kept his jacket over the man's head, shielding him from the rain as they waited. It felt like an eternity before the paramedics arrived. A black car was parked nearby, and 3 individuals were watching the scene unfold. They said nothing but kept their eyes fixed on Mr. Parker. David stood by the window, watching the ambulance take the man away. His heart felt heavy, the weight of his decision pressing on him. The rain was coming down harder now, just as it had when he had made that decision. He knew he had done the right thing, but the worry was gnawing at him. His pension was barely enough to get by, and now he had no cushion to fall back on. "How will I pay for my bills?" he thought. "How will I pay for the next month of rent?" As David walked back to his small apartment, he couldn't help but feel that something bigger than just a simple act of kindness had happened. It wasn't just about helping a homeless man, it was a reminder that he still had purpose, that he still mattered in the world, no matter how small his means. But that night, as he sat at his kitchen table, all he could think of was how little he had. He checked his bank account again, nothing much left. The amount was enough for groceries, but not for anything else. He thought of the man's grateful eyes, the moment when he had given away the last of his savings. He smiled faintly, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. The evening passed quietly. His phone rang suddenly, breaking the silence. The unknown number flashed on the screen. David hesitated, then answered. "Hello." A woman's voice on the other end was polite, professional. Mr. Thomas Parker, she asked. This is Margaret Wells from Wells Industries. I hope you're doing well today. David blinked, confused. Wells Industries? His heart skipped a beat. He'd heard of the company, one of the largest in the country. He couldn't imagine why they would be calling him. I think there's been some mistake, David replied. I'm just a retired teacher. I'm not sure why you're calling. Margaret Wells chuckled softly. No mistake, Mr. Parker. A car will be there to pick you up at 9 a.m. tomorrow. We'd like to meet with you. David's mind raced. What could this be about? His mother ended, now frail and struggling with her own health issues. David stared at the door always be his rock. His mother had always told him to be open, been the one to remind him that his value wasn't in his paycheck, it was real heart. But even her encouraging words couldn't ease the tension in his chest now. Who would want to meet with me? He couldn't sleep that night, constantly checking his phone, making sure the message was real. The address that had been texted to him was the private terminal at the local airport. The next morning, at exactly 9 a.m., a sleek black car pulled up to his modest apartment. The driver opened the door for David, who felt entirely out of place in his old dress pants and shirt, nothing like the well-dressed men he could only imagine from TV shows. As the car drove toward the airport, David noticed the 3 private jets on the tarmac, their sleek bodies gleaming in the morning sunlight. His stomach dropped. He had no idea what was happening, but everything about this situation screamed wealth and power. We're here, Mr. Parker, the driver said, stopping near the largest jet. David felt like a fish out of water, completely out of his league. A small group of people in business suits were standing near the jet, watching him as he stepped out of the car. There she was, the elderly woman he had helped the previous day. But now she was standing tall and smiling, warmly at him, her pain gone. Welcome, Mr. Parker, the elderly woman said, her voice rich and kind. I'm Catherine Wells, owner of Wells Industries. David's mouth went dry. He had helped the CEO of one of the biggest companies in the country. He hadn't recognized her yesterday, but now it made sense. I helped you, David said in a daze. Yes, Catherine smiled warmly. You didn't just help me. You showed something rare, kindness, compassion. And that's what we need. Beside her stood 2 men in expensive suits, both watching David with intense interest. Catherine gestured for David to step aboard the jet. The interior was luxurious, more than David had ever imagined. Leather seats, polished floors, and a view that took his breath away. Catherine sat across from him, her smile warm yet serious. Yesterday, Catherine began, you lost your savings helping me. Not many people would make that choice, especially when they don't have much to give. We've been looking for someone like you. Someone like me, David asked softly. Yes, Mr. Parker. Someone who does the right thing, even when no one is watching. Robert, Catherine's son, leaned forward. We've checked your background. You've worked for years, helping others. You've taken care of your mother, never once backing down from responsibility. We respect that. You're a man of integrity. James, the other son, opened a folder and pointed to a contract. We're expanding our community outreach division, and we need someone with your heart to lead it. Someone who understands struggle and compassion. David's hands trembled as he looked at the contract. A job offer, a high salary, benefits, everything he had never dreamed of. I don't have any experience with corporate work, David said, voice wavering. Catherine smiled, her eyes kind. You don't need experience in corporate work, David. You have the most important qualification, a good heart. Robert slid the contract across the table, showing a salary figure that made David's eyes widen. It was more money than he had ever made in 5 years of teaching. David's heart swelled. But my mother's medical bills, his voice caught in his throat. Catherine reached out, placing a hand on his. Your mother's medical bills will be taken care of, she said, her voice filled with compassion. Starting today. David blinked, unable to comprehend what was happening. Why me, he asked softly. Catherine's gaze met his. Because yesterday, when no one else helped, you did. You saw me as a person, not a problem. And that's exactly the kind of person we need in our company. David's eyes filled with tears as he thought about his mother, their struggles, and how this was a chance to not only change his life but also to help others. He wiped his eyes, his hands still shaking. Catherine and her sons waited patiently as David took a deep breath and signed the contract. When do I start? David asked, his voice still cracking with emotion. Catherine smiled. Right now. I see. It looks like I may have missed the final sections in my previous response. Let me continue and finish the script for you by removing the timestamps and providing the rest of the story. Here's the conclusion, picking up where we left off. David's mind was racing as the car sped toward his apartment. He could barely process what had just happened. The private jet, the luxurious meeting with the Wells family, the job offer, it all felt like a dream, too good to be true. His heart was still pounding in his chest. Catherine Wells, the CEO of Wells Industries, had just promised him a future he never imagined. And now he was on his way to collect his mother, the woman who had always been his rock. David's phone rang. It was his mother. His voice cracked when he picked up. "Mom, I have some news," he said, struggling to hold back the tears. "You need to be ready in 10 minutes. Some people want to meet you." His mother, who had been unwell for so long, was always cautious and skeptical. David could hear the uncertainty in her voice when she asked, "What's going on, David? Where are you?" He tried to reassure her. "It's a good thing, Mum. Just trust me. We're going to be okay." The car arrived at their apartment, and David stepped out, his heart in his throat. His mother was standing at the door, her frail form dressed in a worn-out coat. Her eyes widened when she saw the luxury car parked outside. David walked over, helping her into the car, his hands trembling. She looked at him, confusion and curiosity in her eyes. He squeezed her hand tightly. "Don't worry, Mum," he said quietly. "Everything's about to change." The car took them to the Wells Industries headquarters, a modern, towering building with gleaming glass windows. The contrast between David's humble life and the polished corporate world was jarring. When they arrived, a small group of employees stood watching as they walked into the building. The lobby was impressive, with marble floors and artwork adorning the walls. David's mother looked around in disbelief, unable to comprehend the magnitude of the situation. Inside the building, Robert Wells greeted them warmly. "Welcome to Wells Industries, David. And this is your new office," he said, motioning toward a large room with sweeping city views. David could hardly believe it. This was all so far beyond anything he had imagined. His mother was led to a nearby room, where James Wells was waiting. He smiled at her gently. "We've got a position for you too, Mrs. Parker," he said. "We have an employee assistance program, and we'd love for you to join our team. We need someone who understands what it's like to struggle, someone who can show others the way." David's mother looked at James, stunned. "But I haven't worked in years because of my health." Catherine, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. "This will be flexible work, Mrs. Parker, with full benefits. You'll have everything you need, including health care. We believe your experience is invaluable." David watched as his mother's face softened, tears welling in her eyes. Hope was finally replacing the worry that had plagued her for so long. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. As they walked through the halls of the office, Catherine handed David a set of keys. "This is for your new apartment," she said, with a warm smile. 2 bedrooms, fully furnished, and it's just a short walk from the office. David couldn't believe it. He had given up the last of his pension for a man he didn't know, and now he was receiving more than he could ever imagine. A new job, his mother's health taken care of, and a luxurious new apartment. The thought seemed too surreal to grasp. Nasp. They arrived at their new apartment, a spacious, fully furnished place with views of the city skyline. David helped his mother settle in, and they stood for a moment, looking out the window. David thought about all they had been through, the struggles, the sacrifices, and the long days he had spent worrying about how they would survive. But now, everything was different. The weight of worry had lifted. "Thank you," David whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you for everything." Catherine, who had accompanied them, smiled. "You've earned this, David. You showed true kindness when you didn't have to. That's the kind of person we want in our family." 3 months later, David stood in front of a group of 50 new employees at the Wells Community Care Program. He wore a tailored suit, no longer the worn clothes of a retired teacher, but a man who had found purpose again. His heart swelled with pride as he looked out at the group. "Welcome to Wells Community Care," David said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Our first project opens next week, and we're going to make a real difference in the lives of families who need help." David's program had already helped hundreds of families. 5 new centers were opening across the city to provide support for people struggling with medical bills, job loss, and other hardships. His mother worked down the hall, her health improving every day. She had become a support group leader, sharing her own story and helping others who were facing similar battles. The company grew, and so did David's impact. Every morning he walked through the lobby, where photographs of families who had benefited from their program hung on the walls. Each face reminded him of that rainy day when he made the decision to help a stranger, a decision that had transformed his life in ways he never imagined. Catherine Wells often visited the program, watching David proudly as he led the team. "Do you remember when you asked why we chose you?" she asked one day. "Look around, David. This is why." David thought about his old supervisor, Mr. Peterson. Just a few months ago, he had been fired from his job at the warehouse for breaking the rules. Now, he was helping people, leading a program that was making a tangible difference. And as fate would have it, the warehouse had recently applied to partner with Wells Community Care. David's philosophy had shifted. Some people measure success by what they get, he told his team. We measure it by what we give. His mother sat beside him at lunch every day, often reflecting on their journey. Life is funny, she would say, smiling softly. One moment of kindness changed everything. Later that evening, David visited one of the new community centers. A young woman was helping an elderly man with his paperwork. As they spoke, she looked up and smiled. I almost got fired last month for helping a customer, she said, laughing softly. But then I found this job. It's been a blessing. David nodded, understanding completely. He touched the Wells Industries pin on his suit, which now felt like a symbol of everything he had achieved and all that was yet to come. As he drove home that night, the rain was falling again. But this time, David smiled. He had learned that sometimes the hardest choices lead to the most beautiful changes.